This call is being recorded.
Hello, and I just want to say thank you so much for doing this phone call with me. This topic of autism and trauma and PTSD and how it affects the mental health of not just the parents or the caregiver, but of the entire family is something that we don't talk about. It's something that kind of one of the ugly truths about autism, and I want to kind of take off the mask, come from behind the curtain, and let everyone know that this is real and this is serious, and it can have, long-term effects on everyone who's involved. And to briefly go over my story again, I have a son who has autism, and I also have a daughter who does not. And one day I went to go wake her up to go to school, and she was just in her bed just crying hysterically. And nothing I could do could comfort her. She just cried and cried and cried for hours until she cried herself to sleep. And then when she woke back up, it happened again. And after several days of this, I finally took her to get some help. And they told me, the therapist there told me that she had severe anxiety and depression, and that she needed to go to therapy and get help because my daughter just could not function. And later I found out, because this all came to a surprise to me, I was like, I don't understand what's wrong with you. Nothing should be wrong with you. You are the normal one. You should be fine. And little did I find, afterwards I found out that any issue that she was having in life, any problems, any difficulties she was having in her life, she withheld them from me because she didn't want to bother me, because she knew that my hands were full with her brother. And so she didn't have support from me dealing with whatever issue she had going on in her life. And this has been going on for as long as she can remember. She just didn't bother me. Mom has too much on her plate. I'm not going to bother her. I'll just handle it myself. And it got to a point where she couldn't handle it herself. Unfortunately, my story is not, just my story. I've heard this story over and over and over again. My really good friend, her daughter, around the same age as my daughter, was having suicidal thoughts. She wanted to kill herself. And that came to my friend as a big surprise and a big shock, because, again, she seemed to be doing fine. She seemed to be well. She seemed to be normal. And she was doing the same thing. I'm not going to bother you. You have your hands full. I'm going to try to handle life on my own. And she couldn't, and she broke. My daughter broke. Her daughter broke. And there's a lot of broken children out there who are growing up to be broken adults and not being able to have, a personal relationships with people, and not being able to keep a job and hold a job, and not being able to function in this world because they grew up with a sibling that had autism or some other sort of, disability. And so my question to you is, how come we didn't notice? And what can we do at this point?
Okay, well, first and foremost, I guess we can start off by addressing the first question: how come we didn't notice? And depending on your scenario, and I'm familiar with your story, of course, I've read your articles and I've heard your story through your testimonies and the things that you shared. But first and foremost, let's deal with the adult. The average American is not trained to deal with mental health, period. Unless you go into a profession or unless you are in a clinical background which deals specifically with mental health disorders, for example, counseling, clinical social work, psychology, marriage and family therapy, something along that line that actually deals with that, you're not going to necessarily be familiar. And that's a huge start. And if you ever notice, there are many people who began a ministry or programming or outreach because their family has been affected by it. You see people who have been plagued with, their child being a cancer survivor, and then they advocate for cancer. You see a person whose child has been plagued with, or who has a child who's been abducted, and so they deal with children who've been abducted, sex trafficking, things like that. So it's quite natural. It's a natural process for someone to be in your position because, like you're saying, and you kind of fit the prototype. You and your friend, you're saying, well, hey, we didn't notice. How come we didn't notice? Well, first and foremost, you weren't trained to notice it. Um, Now, in dealing with the child, first, and I'll go here next. Let me say this next. In dealing with one child, as a parent, there are several books out there. There's literature out there, but many of us don't read the books. That goes back to the training. We don't read the books. We don't even really know when we become parents or godparents or caregivers. We don't know all the rights and the wrongs. We don't know all the wrong answers. We don't have all the right answers. So we're going through this whole thing as a trial by trial, case by case scenario to try to get it right ourselves. And quite naturally, we're going to respond to our children's needs. And if you have one child who, for example, you have one child who is autistic and one child is not only are you going to go and to try to attend to their needs, but so is the rest of the family. And because we are not educated enough, we all kind of turn a blind eye to our own needs while trying to focus on the needs of that other person. So with that being said, that's kind of how we get, a lot of people kind of get lost in it. And sometimes it's, when you're dealing with something like this, you have to deal with all the mixed emotions. You still have to deal with the bills. You still have to deal with the other interpersonal relationships within your family. You still have to deal with working as a professional. You still have to deal with all that stuff. And sometimes we just turn away because it's so hard to deal with. And if we do deal with it, we become immediately exhausted, so we don't know how to deal with it. Now, when it comes to that other child, like you said it, you hit the nail right on the head. It's kind of like, well, you're well. What's the matter with you? And one of the things I think that we often as caregivers don't necessarily do is because we're not trained to see between the lines and to read between the lines, we don't do those regular wellness checks on ourselves first. So we don't really practice those wellness checks with everybody else in the house that's dealing with this particular disorder. And autism is something that is very, very, very serious. So that's kind of how we get lost in the sauce. We get lost in the mix sometimes because when you're dealing with something serious, that's your focus, along with all the other responsibilities. And then it's kind of like, well, you have a child or other children in a situation who can be left behind.
So help me understand this. So it's not like we didn't spend time together. It's not like I didn't, have, times where it's like just me and you and we're going to do things, and we've had plenty of opportunities to talk and things like that. We were spending time together. She wasn't ignored.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't put one child before the other. I tried my best to make sure that they both knew that they were loved and treated them, with love, respect, and all these type of things. And still I missed it.
Yeah, and see, and this is one thing that has been very common, and I like the fact that you brought that up, because one of the things that has been very common that people say when they have multiple children that they're raising at the same time is they say, well, I treat my children the same. And I'm going to say this right now, that is a myth. That is a complete myth. And I'm speaking this, and I'm going to clarify why I'm saying this. No matter who you are, no matter how many children you have, if you have more than one child, in a household, you cannot treat them the same. You can have the same rules that you implement, and I think that's a lot of times what people mean. You can show them love, but you respond to your child's needs according to what they present to you. So there is no way that you can necessarily treat them the same. And a lot of people go around with that philosophy saying, hey, well, we were raised this way. But, you can't treat a child the same when one may have a peanut allergy and the other one doesn't. And so, in communicating with your children, a lot of times what we have to do is we have to have those consistent wellness checks to say, "Hey, baby, are you okay? Talk to me. Let me know what's going on. How are you feeling?" And as a mother or as a parent or as a caregiver, you can kind of begin to read between the lines because, for example, like my mother used to always tell me, like when I was growing up, if I had an attitude, and I would try to dispute her and tell her, no, I don't have an attitude. And she's like, baby, I know you. You're upset about something right now. Something is bothering you. But again, it's not to say that, that you ignore your child because many loving parents don't. It's not to say that you don't spend time with them. It's not to say any of that. It's just to say that you have a lot of responsibilities going on, and quite naturally, what the children do is they begin to cope. And unfortunately, a lot of the ways that children cope is to internalize what's happening with them, or they begin to act out, or they they either explode or they implode. They hold it all in until they can't anymore, or they always let out. They act out. And so, when people do that, when that situation happens, it's kind of like, well, I didn't see this coming, and unfortunately, one of the things about children, if you ever notice, like when children go through their parents separating or divorce or anything, they tend to blame themselves.
Yes.
They tend to hold it all in like it was me, like I caused this or I had a part in it or because you hear different things like you could be a tired mom and you could say, hey baby, like your daughter could have wanted your attention, and you're just like at times you might have been like, baby, like I'm hold on, just give me a moment, not right now, I just can't, I'm tired right now. And so then we begin to develop these walls. It's kind of like the onion. We develop these layers that people have to breach to get to our core. And again, like to make that parallel with like a child who is going through the divorce of parents, they internalize that. The moment they hear anything that might validate that is further supporting, if it's fighting and then the child gets brought up, or if or if something is there that is that references them, which many times, when you're dealing with an internal home unit, when you're dealing with the mechanics of it, the child is always a part of that community. So whether they're a direct part of the situation or an indirect part of the situation, they're still a part of the situation, and we begin to cope and to deal with it. And a lot of times with children, again, they internalize it.
That's true. That's true. So, for someone who's in a situation like me or like some of the people that I know, what do we do? How do we fix this?
Okay. Well, in a previous conversation, we talked about one of the best ways to deal with this stuff is helping with prevention. Because we all suffer some type of post-traumatic stress at some point. We all do. It becomes a disorder when it becomes our norm. When our life is so imbalanced that because of this post-traumatic stress, that it's a consistent, and we operate on this continuum of what's happening with the post-traumatic stress, and we react that we can't function properly in regular lives. That's when it becomes a disorder. But I say again, prevention is better many times than intervention, and intervention has its place, but it's easier to begin when you have a child who is dealing with another child or other children in the household. Constantly make sure they are getting their wellness monitored, that you're checking with them, even bring in maybe some other professionals, begin to educate yourself and your family on this whole disorder, because education, opens so many doors. That's one of the first things that you can do. Continue to become educated on this, and don't just hold it in and be the guru for yourself, but educate everyone around you. Educate your family, educate your extended family, educate your child's schools, educate, everyone that you have this information let them know, like your children, because what happens, and this is another situation. What happens is these children they go from the home, and then they carry their um, stresses with them to school and to church and to whatever community events that they have, and people may see them acting out in one area that you don't see them acting out in, if you're at home. So it's always good to have them educated and then to tap into the resources too, because there are people in place like guidance counselors at school, um, people within the community that volunteer and things like that that help you to deal with this burden. That's one thing that you can do. I'd say interpersonally, continue to always monitor your child's behaviors, because some people are not affected and yet some people are. But continue to keep your eye open to see what's going on. If your child isn't expressing, if your child isn't expressing frustrations or anxieties, that's one of the key things that lets you know that something is actually wrong. Because we all have our share of ups, downs, highs, lows. And if you always see a person presenting that they are, their behavior is that they're always happy or they're always, willing to deal with it on their own, that's not necessarily the indication of something healthy. So watch out for that stuff too. Because again, we all have those moments when we're down and we all have those moments when we're up. And we want to make sure that there is some sense of balance there with everything. And it's so hard at times because we get busy and we get caught up in life not to do that. Secondly, the intervention phase. I don't think there are many people who have the same type of treatment plan. If there is something going on with your child, see if you can find someone to help you. There are plenty of theorists, there are plenty of theories, there are plenty of different types of behavior, but make sure that your core group is willing to work through that process together. If this is a family, you should not only seek, I wouldn't necessarily seek an individual one-on-one session with the child that is experiencing this PTSD because of the other child's illness, but I would also try to see if I could get my family involved. For example, if my child was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, I would also see if I could get the other members of the family involved so that they can understand, like your core group, mom, dad, whoever the caregivers are in that household, because it's going to affect everyone. So look at the different types of, modalities or treatment plans and see what the community has to offer. And then always, kind of study for yourself too. Stay abreast on what's going on. Look at the research. See what's out there, because there are a lot of times that these things are out there and we just feel so isolated, and that's one of the major um, negative assumptions that people make, is they feel like they're isolated. And when you're dealing with illness, you feel like you're in it by yourself. And not only are you dealing with the isolation from the autism, but now you're dealing with isolation from the post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we kind of box ourselves away to present ourselves as things are okay, but in essence, things are not okay, but you're not alone, and you have to realize that you're not alone. So go out there and get help, remain educated, and then implement the things that you're learning. Try out some of these different things and see what it is that you can do. See what works for other people. They might work for you, they might not, but there's definitely some resources out there for you to try to see if they will help.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to help and to educate not only me, but everyone who will be listening and or reading this conversation that we're having. Is there any last piece of advice that you want to give to the moms, the dads, the grandmothers, the caregivers, the siblings, the aunts and uncles who are out there saying, my family's broken, my family needs help?
I think, if anything, I would say this: you are not alone. And I want to emphasize that from the perspective of saying that somewhere in your gene pool and your family structure, all families are broken. all families have disparities, all families have marginalized groups, all families have issues that we have to deal with. And in certain communities, we tend to feel like, and I'm speaking from the perspective of being an African American man, I knew that there were issues happening with me, and I'm a mental health therapist now, but what led me to participating and becoming a mental health professional is because my mother, when I was 10 years old, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And she is she was a single parent. I was an only child, so it was just the two of us. And that really affected me in so many different ways. But I say all of that to say that no matter who you are, no matter where you are not alone. Your family has issues. My family has issues. And I think that one of, again, the biggest things that we can do is continue to educate ourselves to understand that no, I'm not alone, and that there is help out there for me and for my family. We can get through this. We will get through this, but don't try to just fix it yourself. Don't try to internalize that thing yourself and to deal with it all by yourself, because there are people who not only can help you but will help you. There are people who have your story or very similar accounts to your story. You know, one of the things I learned from you, Contessa, and I'm trying to implement this, is that we all have a story. And so it is through sharing your story that you are empowered. And I'll leave you with this note. One of the things that I did while I was in college is I became very open to sharing my mother's condition with people around me. I was studying psychology at the time, um, and I was sharing this with other people, and then I would have certain people, they would come up to me after the fact, and they would say, "Oh my God, you're so brave." And I'm like, "Well, what does that mean?" They're like, "I want to be brave like that. I want to be able to share it." And people will come to me and say, "Well, my mother has schizophrenia too," or my dad, or this family member has this going on, and I want to be able to share that. And it was a moment for healing for them and encouragement for me, because I understood at that moment that that was one step closer to them being free from that emotional and spiritual turmoil that they were going through, but they were keeping it inside. So just know you're not alone. We all have something that we can fix, and it takes effort, but it can be done. And I think
Thank
that's
you.
all. No problem.
Thank you so much, Lamont. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Not a problem.